To understand the great reset that the world is heading toward in 2030, you must go back to a quiet, almost invisible moment in history. August 15th, 1971. A day that looked ordinary on the surface. No war, no riots, no global protest, just a simple speech from the Oval Office. But behind that calm exterior, the world's financial DNA was rewritten forever. On that day, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would no longer allow dollars to be exchanged for gold. It sounded technical, boring, almost irrelevant to everyday life. But in reality, this decision detonated a silent shockwave that reshaped global power, debt, wealth, inequality, and the future of every economy. Before 1971, money meant something. It was backed by a real, physical asset, gold, something governments couldn't print at will. But after the gold window closed, money became abstract, unlimited, and deeply political. It was no longer tied to value. It was tied to trust. And that trust could be manipulated. This wasn't a temporary shift. It was the foundation of a new global order. A world where governments could borrow infinitely, where central banks could create money out of nothing, and where financial markets would eventually become disconnected from real economic life. What began as an emergency measure became the blueprint for the next 50 years, and ultimately, the launchpad for the world we are entering now. A world where currency is digital debt, is permanent inequality, is engineered, and economic resets are planned decades in advance. 1971 wasn't just a policy change. It was the opening move of a long-term game, one that leads directly to 2030, when the consequences finally converge. The year 1971 didn't just mark a financial policy change. It marked a civilizational pivot, a quiet rewiring of how the world understood money, value, and economic power. Most people never realized what really happened because the transformation was disguised as a technical adjustment. But behind closed doors, leaders, bankers, and economists understood the magnitude of the moment. The rules of the global game were being rewritten forever. Until 1971, the U.S. dollar had one powerful anchor, gold. Every dollar represented a real, physical asset. Governments couldn't create money without restraint, and global trade relied on stable, predictable value. But as the costs of war, social programs, and international deals grew heavier, the U.S. could no longer maintain that system. So President Nixon made the announcement that would echo through the next century. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. In that single decision, money became an idea rather than a promise. It became debt instead of value. And once money became debt, it could be created infinitely. This shift didn't just free governments. It empowered central banks, financial institutions, and elite economic planners to shape the world according to their interests. The quiet shift of 1971 set in motion a chain reaction. Inflation no longer had brakes. Wealth began flowing upward instead of outward. Countries became dependent on the U.S. financial system. The middle class began its slow erosion. Global debt skyrocketed. Corporations gained more influence than many nations. But the most important consequence? It created the blueprint for 2030, the era of digital currency, surveillance finance, universal debt, and centralized economic control. 1971 wasn't just a date. It was the birth of the modern world and the beginning of the real Great Reset. By the late 1980s, the world believed it was experiencing a golden age of global growth. Stock markets were booming, trade barriers were falling, and nations were celebrating what seemed like the dawn of a more connected, cooperative future. But behind this glossy picture, something far more important and far more dangerous was quietly taking place. Countries were losing control of their own economic destiny without even realizing it. The shift was subtle because it did not happen through war, revolution, or political takeover. It happened through incentives. After 1971, once money was cut loose from real value, governments found themselves dependent on endless borrowing to maintain growth, fund promises, and avoid public anger. At first, this seemed harmless. Interest rates were low, banks were eager, and global institutions encouraged more lending. But debt has gravity, and by the 1990s, countries discovered that their financial decisions were no longer fully theirs. A small handful of international entities, central banks, lenders, rating agencies, and currency markets began to hold unprecedented power. A single downgrade could crash an economy. A slight change in interest rates in the U.S. could trigger a recession across Asia, Africa, or Latin America. Countries were sovereign only on paper. In reality, they were plugged into a financial machine built after 1971, and that machine set the rules. By the early 2000s, the imbalance was complete. Nations could elect leaders, pass laws, or sign treaties, but none of it mattered if global markets disagreed. Any attempt to break from the system resulted in capital flight, currency collapse, or foreign intervention. This is the silent shift most people never saw. By the time the world started talking about the Great Reset decades later, the true reset had already happened. Economic sovereignty had quietly evaporated, and no one bothered to announce it. When people talk about global revolutions, they imagine dramatic events, protests, collapsed governments, or financial crashes. But the most important global shift of the last century didn't happen with noise. It happened quietly, in meeting rooms, through policy papers, and in a single presidential speech that most people didn't fully understand. That shift was the break from the gold standard in 1971, a moment that didn't just change economic rules, it changed the entire structure of power. Before 1971, money was limited by something physical, gold. After 1971, money became a pure concept, something that could be created at will, digitized, multiplied, and weaponized. It was the moment when governments and central banks discovered they could print influence, debt, and global control. But the deeper shift wasn't about currency. It was about who controlled the world's future. By removing the anchor of gold, global finance became dependent on the U.S. dollar and the Federal Reserve. This gave the U.S. a silent superpower, the ability to influence other nations without armies, simply through debt, interest rates, and international banking networks. Meanwhile, organizations like the IMF, BS, and World Bank grew into powerful technocratic institutions that operated above politics, shaping the world economy through lending, structural adjustments, and global standards. Most citizens never learned their names. But these institutions became the architects of a new global order, one where currencies, trade routes, and national policies all pointed in the same direction. The world didn't notice the shift because life continued as usual. Prices changed slowly. Debt grew quietly. But beneath the surface, a new operating system was being installed, one that would make the events of 2030 not a conspiracy, but a logical conclusion of a system designed in 1971. That the reset wasn't sudden. It was engineered over decades, one silent policy at a time. To understand why so many world leaders, corporations, central banks, and global institutions speak in perfect synchronization about 2030, you need to realize something crucial. 2030 is not the beginning of a plan. It is the deadline of a project that started half a century ago. The decisions made in 1971 created a system that could not survive indefinitely, and 2030 marks the moment when that system reaches its breaking point. By unlinking the dollar from gold in 1971 and shifting the world into a debt-based, infinite expansion model, policymakers knew this new structure would eventually face a mathematical wall. Debt would rise faster than production. Currency would lose purchasing power. Wealth inequality would widen until social pressure reached explosive levels. Governments would need more control. Economies would need new rules. And societies would need new narratives. Fast forward to today. Everything from climate goals to digital currency projects to ESG standards to mass surveillance to the restructuring of global supply chains is part of a transition into a post-1971 financial world. They call it sustainability. They call it modernization. They call it the new economic architecture. But in reality, it is the world adjusting to a system that can no longer function as originally engineered. The final phase is simple. Control the currency, control the data, control the population, and reboot the economy under a new global model. Whether this reset becomes a revival or a collapse depends on one thing: who controls the new rules when the clock hits 2030.